Good. Our third speaker of the day is, yeah, we will move the mic a little bit closer. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Sorry, one question. Do you want me to share it on this computer, or do you want to share it from yours? Either way.
You can share from yours, it would be better.
Okay. Okay. I'll do it. Yeah. Okay. Good. So, sorry about this. Our third speaker of today is my pleasure to introduce her to you. She's also an old friend of mine, Jimena. She's professor of history of modern philosophy at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, and her research is in the history of philosophy and political philosophy, focusing especially on Spinoza and the reception of Spinoza in German idealism. And more recently, she has been working a lot on Fichte, and she's also the main, so to say, the president of the Latin American Fichte Society. Kind of. Yeah. And I want to mention there's some publications of hers. So she published a book on Spinoza's reception in Germany called Spinoza in Alemania, Storia della Santificazione di un filosofo maldito in 2009. And I also want to mention this very nice book that she co-edited together with Sandra Palermo and Mariano Gaudio, about the reception of Fichte in the Americas. So the book is called Fichte en las Americas, and there are several papers on the reception of Fichte in Latin America. I think the book was also translated into English, or is being translated into English?
Already translated, and it will appear.
It will appear. Okay, so it is forthcoming also in English. So and it's a really nice book, and I can also turn it around if you want to take a look. And so yes, it's my pleasure, and please, I have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Luis, for this wonderful invitation and presentation, and thank you all for organizing this wonderful event. Well, I'll jump right in. The title of my talk is Fichte in Latin America, Ideas and Perspectives for a Decolonial Philosophy. For some time now, in Latin America, we have been witnessing the questioning of the philosophical canon. Driven by movements such as philosophy of liberation, decolonial thought, and feminism, this climate of renewal makes us not only review our sources, those we study and those we teach, but also rethink the very principles and values guiding our activity as academics. A question that echoes in the voices of Latin American thinkers, since these lands and those lands ceased to be a colony and became politically independent nations, is once again raised. How to produce our own thought, a philosophy that is ours, and not a mere imitation of European philosophy. Indeed, just as the Argentine intellectuals who at the beginning of the 19th century called for the development of a national philosophy to cut the invisible chains of cultural dependence that kept us subjected to European powers, we also experience today the need to continue cementing our autonomy, to think and build ourselves with concepts forged in our own story, in our own languages, and in our own context. Although it is certainly uncomfortable and even painful, it is also inevitable for those of us who have been formed in the European philosophy paradigm to recognize that the authors we study and love may be those who subjugate us and prevent us from philosophizing. How can we study the German idealists without remaining in a painful mental coloniality? How can we read, teach, and translate Fichte without giving up our own code? This concern has fueled many of the discussions held during the last years in the research group on idealism at the University of Buenos Aires, which we coordinate together with Mariano Gaudio and Sandra Palermo. It has also fueled some concrete initiatives, among others, the dossier published in the last issue of the philosophy journal Idea, dedicated to explore the legitimacy and specificity of an eventual Latin American philosophy. The third edition of our conferences, Caminos Cruzados, where we put Spinoza, Fichte, and Deleuze in discussion with Argentine thinkers. And finally, the project Fichte en las Américas, to which some of you have contributed, which we mentioned in the book, and has marked a turning point for many of us. Indeed, rediscovering the existence of a tradition of readings of Fichte's philosophy in our lands, finding his spirit in the letter and in the actions of central figures of our own history and our culture, attesting the fruitfulness of his ideas, reinterpreted on the American soil to intervene in our contemporary problems, completely transformed our relation with his thought. Fichte is no longer the same for us. He appears to us as an ally in our efforts to develop a philosophy of our own. Drawing from the results of this collective search, I will first address Fichte's position on colonialism based on the contribution to the correction of the public's judgment on the French Revolution. And then, second, I will turn to the addresses to the German nation to show in what sense and read in what way Fichte can be an ally in our quest and struggle. To conclude, I will share some thoughts and reflections on the possibility of developing a decolonial philosophy. The first part, from the critic of colonialism to the defense of it. Fichte's stand on colonialism is clear. Colonialism, understood in its plainest terms as the occupation of the territory of one nation by another and the subjugation of one people by another, is nothing more than a form of despotism, rooted in a dogmatic worldview. It is, in short, one of the many phases of dogmatism, the enemy against which Fichte develops his system, and which he confronts in each of his writings. A justification of colonialism would be incompatible with the spirit of his philosophy, which, as we know, Fichte himself presents as the first system of freedom. But it is also incompatible with its letter. Already in his contribution, he explicitly states his rejection of colonialism, inseparably entwined with the criticism of monarchical despotism and his defense of freedom of thought. Indeed, relying on the foundations of the incipient Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte aims in this text to establish the legitimacy of a political revolution. That is, to argue that a people has the right to change its constitution. The cornerstone of this argument is the claim that the final end of the state cannot be an obstacle for human beings to search their own final end, to reach their own final end. and it should also be allowed. The final end of each individual and of all humanity, Fichte claims, is culture. Culture is, and I quote, the exercise of all forces to the end of complete freedom, the complete independence from everything that is not what we ourselves are ever. So culture is the gradual process leading to the restitution of the primordial form of our I, as it would be without anything coming from experience of our primordial independent activity. That's what Fichte calls self-state. So Fichte goes on to ask whether culture for freedom, culture toward freedom, is the final end that the monarchs had in mind when founding and governing their states. Leaving aside what they say about their final end, Fichte examines their actions and maintains that the maxim guiding their acts is the absolute rule of the monarch's will inside and the expansion of the borders externally. Despotism and colonialism are, according to Fichte, the two inseparable elements of every absolute monarchy. Inwardly and outwardly, it is only a matter of unlimited domination and subjugation. As is evident, these ends not only do not contribute to the culture toward freedom of human beings, but represent an obstacle to its unfolding. Regarding the absolutism of the monarch's will, Fichte argues that he does not understand how we could increase our independent activity and reestablish our pure selfhood if only the monarchs act independent, if only they have a will, if only their minds set millions of bodies in motion. And regarding to the impulse to expand the frontiers, he states that he does not understand what our culture could gain, whether the will of our king prevails over the will of a few thousand more men or not. It is easy to grasp conclusion, but before making it explicit, Fichte goes on to unmask the fallacious defense of absolute monarchy that appeals to the theory of the balance of powers. And in doing so, the incompatibility between colonialism and the vocation of humanity becomes even clearer. According to this theory, there must be multiple strong monarchies in order to preserve a balance of power in Europe. Each should be as powerful on the inside and as expansive on the outside as possible. Granting that this balance is the final end pursued by monarchical constitutions, it is legitimate to ask why it should be maintained at all. Is the present situation better than the feared destruction of balance? Asks Fichte. The answer is no. To avoid our subjugation by a foreign power, monarchs subjugate their subjects without limit. To protect them from a war of one against all, they force them to engage in endless wars. The constant striving after enlargement internally and externally is an immense misfortune for the people. And if it is true that it must be endured in order to avoid a greater misfortune, then, according to Fichte, let us seek out the source of that great misery and derive it if it is possible. So the source is immediately pointed out. The cause of the miserable situation in which human beings find themselves is the unlimited monarchical constitution, to which all monarchies tend. It is the very form of government based on the tendency to enlargement and unlimited domination that leads kings not only to arm themselves, but also to invade foreign territory. Therefore, Fichte concludes, since the human race does not want to put up with this tremendous amount of miseries, there should be no unlimited monarchy. Such constitutions may and should be modified. Indeed, in these circumstances, a political revolution is completely legitimate. Since the constitution of unlimited monarchy prevents the progress of culture toward freedom, which human beings cannot renounce without renouncing their humanity. Absolute monarchy denies the moral character of human beings and transforms them into objects, a cog in a machine, an automaton whose life is reduced to obeying orders and fulfilling other people's ends. Absolute monarchs do not strive to maintain the balance of power, nor to protect the people from outside invasion. Their aim, in Fichte's words, has been to annihilate all free will in humanity except their own. To achieve this, to smother the last seed of independent activity in human beings and render them completely passive, they have made their opinions entirely dependent on an external authority. He who is not allowed to determine what he wants to believe, says Fichte, will never dare to determine what he wants to do. Censorship, persecution, and indoctrination prove to be the most powerful and effective yokes to keep the people in bondage. Slavery, whether exercised by the monarch himself or by an invader, by the monarch himself or by an invader, persists only through the prior imposition of spiritual slavery. That is why Fichte's criticism of absolutism and the colonialism that is inherent to it is connected with a radical vindication of freedom of thought and especially of expression. According to Fichte, communication between free spirits is the best means for their formation. If people are prevented from forming themselves, he warns, if the progress of culture is hindered, then violent revolutions become necessary. Second part, in the vindication of freedom to the criticism of cosmopolitanism. Criticism of colonialism and despotism leads to the discovery of spiritual slavery as the root of all forms of subjugation. We must free our understanding if we want to free our will and fulfill our vocation. Fichte calls upon us to think independently and not to allow any external factor, sensibility, inclination, authority, tradition, fashion, and the long, etc., to impose a way of thinking on us. In full consonance with what Kant famously identified as the motto of enlightenment, Fichte summons us to have the courage to use our own understanding. Now, although the letter of this invitation may coincide with our own aspirations, we want to think for ourselves and develop a philosophy of our own, we in Latin America. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, we Latin Americans have learned to distrust its spirit. As long as it implies that we embrace the universalism of modern Western reason, the Enlightenment motto loses for us its emancipatory power and sinks us into an embarrassing minority bench. However, this is not Fichte's proposal, at least not as we choose to read him. Fichte's appeal to use our own reason to rid ourselves of everything that is not our pure self does not demand the sacrifice of our peculiarities, of our own identity. On the contrary, it requires knowing, protecting, and strengthening. This is clear in his addresses to the German nation, where the criticism of universal monarchy leads to an explicit rejection of the cosmopolitanism that hides the imposition of the idiosyncrasy and language of one nation on all humanity. Certainly, Fichte's criticism of cosmopolitanism points to the nerve that runs through any attempt to develop a national philosophy. It has been the subject of extensive debate among specialists, but if it continues to challenge Latin American scholars, see among others the recent contributions to thinking this subject by Mariano Gaudio, Sandra Palermo, Luis Felipe Garcia, and Tiago Santoro. Perhaps this is because Fichte provides us with the opportunity to rethink the relation between universal and particular within the horizon of a philosophical political project that is not willing to renounce neither the idea of humanity nor the idea of nation. Calling upon the German people to rebuild their national unity as the only means of resisting the Napoleonic invasion, Fichte writes, spiritual nature, so this quote is from the addresses to the German nation. Spiritual nature was able to represent the essence of humanity only in highly manifold gradations of individuals and of individuality in general. Only as each of these people, left to itself and in accordance with its peculiar quality, develops and takes shape, and as every individual among that group, in accordance with his common quality as well as with his own, develops and takes shape, is the appearance of divinity reflected in its proper mirror, as it should be. And only he who either had not the least inkling of lawfulness and divine order, or was an implacable enemy thereof, could dare to interfere in that supreme law of the spiritual world. Only in the invisible particularities of nations, which are concealed even from their own eyes, as that which connects them with the source of original life, like the guarantee of their present and future dignity, virtue, and merit. Colonialism and cosmopolitanism, insofar as they entail the obliteration of the differences that exist in nations, undermine the very essence of humanity, which is expressed in the richness and multiplicity of peoples and individuals. It is not a matter of the mere assertion of the undeniable variety that characterizes the diverse native cultures, but of the vindication of that variety as the result of the supreme law of the spiritual world. The peculiarities of nations are the nexus that links them to the primary source of life and guarantees them a present and a future. That is why Fichte encourages the German people, defeated by arms and seduced by foreignism, one of the worst forms of spiritual slavery, to recover its unity, to rediscover its own character, to rebuild what Fichte calls the inner frontier. As we know, according to the addresses, what makes people is neither blood nor territory, but the invisible ties that they share, language built among its members. A living language is a language that preserves something of its own, pure, free from the harmful foreign influences. A language that does not renounce itself, that is inhabited by the people, that is changing and creative, and is in permanent formation. This collective practical activity, this permanent formation, is what each people must protect and foster if it does not want to lose itself. The peculiar character of a people is not therefore a fixed essence, a place for a genealogical tree, nor any other historical or empirical feature. It is a collective activity of permanent self-genesis. The development of culture, and therefore the progress of humanity, is achieved through the deepening of the peculiar quality of each nation. The promotion of one's own culture is the sole vehicle for the realization of the universe. As some specialists have rightly pointed out, to believe that Fichte is arguing for a strengthening of the national quality only for Germany, and to believe that he's calling for the Germans to impose their culture on other supposedly weaker or more undeveloped culture, implies transforming him into a highly incoherent author. And as some Latin American colleagues have sharply pointed out, to subscribe to those readings that make Fichte an advocate of colonialism and the stateless nationalism, readings that, despite their incoherence, still seem to have great influence, would speak very badly of us as readers. Indeed, shortly after the paragraph that we have just quoted, Fichte draws a distinction between two kinds of people. There are peoples who are completely self-absorbed and are therefore obliged to believe that there is only one possible way to exist as a man of culture, their own way. Thus, they believe that the destiny of humanity is to become just like them. These kind of peoples are unable to cultivate anything. They only want to annihilate what exists in order to create an empty space and reproduce their own form. But there are also peoples who, while retaining their particularity and wishing that it be respected, recognize, grant, and permit other peoples their own particularities also. That's a quote from the other. Between peoples of this second kind, said Fichte, takes place an interaction of their culture and education. They establish relationships of reciprocal influence, highly beneficial for all. Building one's national unity does not lead to the invasion of neighboring territories, does not justify war or the taking of slaves, nor does it imply the annihilation of the culture of the invaded people or the imposition of one's own idiosyncrasy as the only valid one. On the contrary, nationalism, as Fichte understands it, promotes and promotes it in his perspective, is based on the respect for the peculiar quality, idiosyncrasy, and language of all other nations, and makes it clear that the way to make progress in culture consists in establishing ties of reciprocal action with other groups. Now coming to my concluding remarks, Fichte as an ally. Fichte's exhortation to freedom is not limited to the exhortation to think for oneself, to obey reasonable religion, but includes and emphasizes the need to recognize and deepen the distinctive traits that are the source of one's life and dignity, and open the possibility of building mutually beneficial ties with others. Not only do we find it in this text an explicit criticism of colonialism and cosmopolitanism, but we also find a call to preserve what is original in individuals and people. Adding another dimension to the Kantian motto, Fichte encourages us to think for ourselves as ourselves. It is in this sense that he appears as an ally. Far from imposing a universal rationality that erases differences and focuses us to forget our peculiarities, Fichte argues that the only way to philosophize, to develop our own autonomous thought, is by recognizing and protecting our peculiar qualities. Our peculiarities are not an obstacle to philosophy, but are rather its condition of philosophy. Highlighting this aspect of Fichte's thought, and moving away, on the other hand, from interpretations that link it to universalism, nationalism, and even totalitarianism, is the result of a decision. We have decided to move away from the temptation of a literal and disconnected reading, to make the effort of understanding the spirit, separating it from the letter where necessary. We decided to practice an active reading that seeks to engage and appropriate the ideas that emerge in the encounter with the text, bring them to our land and to our present, to make use of them for our formation. Certainly, it is thanks to the decolonial perspective that our reading can transform Fichte into an ally. But it is not a matter of considering him an antecedent, a precursor of decolonial philosophy, but of showing that read from this perspective, with our interests and questions, with our history and from our situation, his writings serve as a device that makes our ideas resonate. Indeed, Fichte invites us to think with him, not to passively accept his ideas. He teaches that philosophy is not to be found in books, but is the result of a free activity that each one must undertake. He urges us to think without external conditioning, to produce a philosophy that is our own and is not at the service of other people's interests. If Fichte challenges us, it is because his calling to action and autonomy resonates in us, inhabitants of a region that still struggles to emancipate itself, a region still considered materially and symbolically peripheral, that strives for the recognition of its right to participate in the development of culture. Thus, adopting the most resolute Fichte spirit, perhaps we can even say that by considering him as an ally in our strive toward producing and practicing a decolonial philosophy, today in Latin America, we understand Fichte better than he understood himself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this very stimulating talk. And now questions, we have several. Okay, so we'll start with you, but I would ask you to come a little closer to the mic, otherwise people won't hear you. If you could ask on this computer, it would be great.
Well, no, actually, you have to be closer to that.
Yeah,
It's not from here.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful paper. It was really interesting to hear. My question is perhaps a little bit more about the motivation and like the fundamental idea, which is the embracing of one's culture. Because for me, I'm not sure if it is because of when I was born that I was born at the beginning of the 21st century, so I was already introduced to a world which was full of interconnections, all nationalities overlapping, sort of this cultural transcendental movement that the boundaries don't really exist. So when you want to, in a way, return to this uniqueness, personal identity of nation, I find it hard to conceive of what does that exactly mean. So if you could please elaborate a little bit more on that.
Thank you for your question. It's really interesting because I think your question points to a very contemporary issue, that is the fact that in fact all nations seem to be interacting and overlapping and becoming very similar in a way, but also in present there are also a lot of national movements, like for example in Spain, each different nation has its own language and is defending this language and is defending its own national identity that does not have to do with being Spanish, but for example being part of a smaller nation that has a different history or one, and that happens also in Latin America. That's very strong in Latin America with original peoples there. So I think both phenomena are simultaneous right now, and I understand that this criticism of cosmopolitanism would be an interesting way of looking at the negative aspect of this gentrification process that tends to make every capital city of the world similar and tends to find or tends to bring up young people who were born 15 years ago, 20 years ago in a similar way. But that does not erase the issue that there are deep feelings of national identity that live along and persist. So I wouldn't know how to address the issue or to analyze it further, but I would say that both tendencies are very present and easy to find. But for us in Latin America, it's very clear from a decolonial point of view that philosophy, when it's imported and it's imposed as the only possible paradigm, then that's an act of violence.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for teaching me so much. I have two questions, but I'll be quick. The first is, you said that Fichte puts his critique of absolute monarchy, despotism, and colonialism together.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how that relates to his critique of Napoleon's imperialism invasion, since it was post-revolution.
Yeah.
And the second is, when you were talking about a living language, you did define it as, for him, being free from harmful influences from outside. So I am wondering, that does sound like a linguistic purism that he is advocating. So I wondered
Thank you.
what your thoughts are.
Thank you for both questions. So regarding the first one, the two works I quoted from Fichte, the Fichte are trying to show that the French Revolution was legitimate, and they Fichte argues in favor of a change of constitution by showing that monarchical absolutism is a system that tends to an absolute monarchy that ultimately is an obstacle for culture and for Bildung and for humanity to really be free. So in that sense, monarchical absolutism that comes together always with colonialism is criticized. Now, the addresses to the German nation happen in a completely different context, and it's the very Germany that it's being invaded by Napoleon. So the criticism to colonialism still stands, of course, but it is kind of the arguments are given by the colonized. And so Fichte is trying to build up the confidence of a broken nation that has completely lost its unity and the feeling of pride and patriotism. So the whole project of the addresses is to propose a new education system in order to rebuild the German nation as a nation that is full of pride and full of power and is full. And the way that he proposes to go is kind of first by building this this unity and this sentiment from below and trying to resist invasion kind of as a popular movement. So so the ideas or Fichte's stand does not change. What changes is the context. I don't know if that answers your first question. And regarding language, actually, we struggle a lot with Fichte's account of language in the addresses to the German nation. He speaks there of an Ursprache, kind of an original or primordial language. That Ursprache is what provides in some kind or some version of the language we speak. And it's, so to say, the living seed or the living activity that is exercised every time we communicate. I wouldn't have a lot of I wouldn't have a lot to say about purism or not. The fact is that Fichte is not very clear to what he's pointing, at what he's pointing. Of course, he's thinking of something original, but that original is never an essence in Fichte, it's never a thing, it's always an activity. So if there is a purism, it's the purism of activity, a self-activity or self-thing, but not some kind of language that we could find in our history or past.
Okay, so we still have 4 questions, so please keep it brief. And I think the next one's Franz.
It was already answered.
It was already answered. Okay, good. And then Günther.
Thank you, Jimena. I deeply sympathize with your enthusiasm for Fichte's freedom philosophy and its potential for colonial, post-colonial, decolonial contexts. That said, I would distinguish between the importance and significance that Fichte has through today as a legal philosopher and a social philosopher, but I would question his insights as a political philosopher, especially when it comes to his thinking about the nation. And I would question how far his philosophy of freedom really carries into, justifies, or survives his nationalism that is a very invasive nationalism of national education, of directional programs to shape the nation in ways that I perceive as entirely unmodern, anti-modern, illiberal, in ways that are quite remarkable and historically interesting, but that point to deeply problematic filiations in the subsequent history in the 19th and the 20th century. And even before Fichte, the very resort to the term nation in a political sense arises in the French Revolution when suddenly there's talk about la nation. It's the reconfigured third estate, tiers étoile, that is presented as la nation in the theoretical text and in the practice, right into the Marseillaise text also. So from the beginning, nation has this double orientation toward internal cohesion and external exclusion, or alternative but continuous with that, aggression. And this is a development that shapes the relatively short history of the nation as a political entity, just the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars on one side and the end of World War II on the other side, at the end of which new nations are created, but they are subject immediately to reconfigurations in larger imperial spaces and to redrawing of boundaries after the next World War then, so far the latest one. So I think that the cosmopolitan intention might be the more interesting heritage here, might even be more the Kantian heritage than the Fichtean one. And I'm very skeptical about using Fichte's conception of nation, not because it's in any way already ethnic or racial, not at all, but it has other politically sensitive and problematic features. This inclusionist in the inside, exclusionist in the outside, and also this internationally bellicose feature. What do you think about putting a spin like that on the nation concept in Fichte for your colonial, post-colonial context? But thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your ideas. No, I would have no such issue with any of what you just brought up. I think, well, I don't know if you know that, but in the Constitution of Argentina, it says that anyone who wants to inhabit Argentinian soil is welcome to come. So
Yeah.
there's no external exclusion in the foundation of the new Latin American countries. And the idea of nation that the new Latin American republics embrace is completely different from the ideas of nations that Europe finds after the Second World War. So that is kind of very much in line with these readings of Fichte in Latin America, trying to find in Fichte some elements that clearly were not successful in shaping European nations, but were clearly very, very efficient in the building of the new American nations, because the very idea of people had to be reinvented in America in order to build the idea of nation. So Fichte's account of nationalism in the addresses, with all its effects and everything that we could criticize, and we could here exercise the power to separate spirit from letter, but the idea of nation that Fichte shares with us there, and also the idea of people, of what makes a people and how a people becomes a people. That is something that seems to be very much in line with what the political thinkers and political actors in America were trying to do, the problems they were trying to solve. So all the considerations of the invasiveness of an education taken up by the state, all that could be seen from a liberal point of view, or maybe from a European point of view today, as something that is invasive, is really not the case in Latin America, where if the state does not take up education, then education is inexistent or is only left for the rich. So it is all the way, well, it's the contrary situation. If the state does not take up an education that shapes in a Fichtean spirit towards freedom, then no one can be free, no one can be an agent of their own lives, and no one can fulfill any kind of autonomous project in their life. So I guess for us, it wouldn't be unmodern to to dig in Fichte's texts to find some inspiration for new projects in building up our lives.
Thank you.
Good. Lisa? May?
Yeah.
Okay. Then Elvira.
Thank you so much for the absolutely fascinating talk. I learned so much and I very much enjoyed it. Really, my question is up in the opposite direction of Professor Silver's question. So I'm extremely sympathetic to your characterization of the importance of a certain version of nationality and patriotism. And in particular, there's a lot of touchstones in Africana philosophy and, for example, Du Bois's philosophy of folk spirit and trying to define a sense of Black American identity in contradistinction from white supremacist ideology, and sort of how is that continuous or discontinuous with American and European modernity. So I feel like there's a lot of substantive overlap. So my question is, if you could just say a little bit more about the normative value of defending particularity and community and sort of what this ongoing dynamic, historically sensitive project would look like. So I'm trying to pick up on sort of some key notes of your account, particularly your response to the last question. So you spoke on the one hand of sort of pride and patriotism, and it suggested that there's something like an independent good to affirm one's sense of psychological power or something like that. You exist in the world, that there's standing visibility. And I feel like that's really important. You had also touched on something like self-defense, right? That one has the ability to sort of define one's place on the earth. And that's, of course, tied to nation states in a really sort of vexatious way. But again, that's connected to sort of Black nationalist politics, so it's psychological, it's self-defense. But it also seems like there's something even deeper here, which is, what does it mean to be a free people at all is bound up with what it means to be a people. Mm-hmm. Like, how do we even define what a community is like? And so one thought that I had, and is particularly in your response to the previous question, is that what is different about what's happening in sort of the Latin American experiments of nation building is that it is fundamentally inclusive, racially inclusive, and it's tied to a history of welcoming immigrants and refugees in a way that sort of North America is like not quite pulled off. And that seems to me like a really different kind of guiding star for thinking about what it means to be a free people in the first place. So it's not just psychological or self-defense, but it's something deeper about what it means to be free that's tied to the particularity of the folk. And I just want to hear your thoughts about that, if you could say a little bit more, if I'm off base.
Well, thank you, Elvira, and thank you for the wonderful question. I think what you brought up would be my answer. It would be, I would focus on these two elements of preserving something that is our own. That is something that is kind of, or one could identify as the spirit of Fichte's philosophy. The idea that one is pure activity, self-dedicated, this originary or primordial activity, that is freedom. And the whole project of one's life and the path that one must go through throughout this building process is to identify what can be an obstacle for the development of this self-dedicated and what could eventually be useful for the development of this self-dedicated. I think what it's, of course, it's an open project, and I only wanted to share some thoughts and directions of how would one think about this, what makes a people a people and what makes a community a free community. But I think what Fichte is allowing us to start to think or to start to imagine is that, well, not everything is in accordance with my ability or my capacity to be free to exercise this right? As an individual and as a community. So it is not a question of essences. I think it is not looking for what is Deutschheit as an essence, a fixed thing that we could identify and preserve. And that is not what we are seeing in these writings as something positive. Of course, the idea is that we can discover in our actions and in our different moments of life, what would contribute to our freedom, and knowing to identify what is an obstacle and what would contribute, that would kind of give us the notion of where we stand as a community or as an individual. But to be able to recognize this, to be able to own up to one's own capacity to be free, that takes a collective effort. That is not something that an individual can do alone. And that is why the community is involved from the beginning. So a free community would give or would raise free individuals, but also those free individuals would also make the community free. And it is always seen by Fichte as a unique movement or a one soul movement. I don't know if I answered, sorry, but thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So please join me in the